When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, global condemnation and sanctions followed. But when those failed to stop the Iraqi dictator in his tracks, a US-led coalition launched Operation Desert Storm to stop his invasion by force. For 6 weeks between January 17th and February 28th, 1991, coalition forces descended on Iraq, using devastating air power to shatter Saddam's regime and force him out of Kuwait. The campaign was a success, but it did not come without cost or controversy. Today, on A Day in History, we'll look at the darker side of Desert Storm, at the suffering of innocent civilians caught up in a war they never chose, at the hundreds who died from the coalition's celebrated precision bombs, and the Iraqi troops who died by the hundreds as they tried to retreat. If this sounds interesting to you, then consider subscribing to our channel for more videos like this, and leaving a like to show your support. Desert Storm launched on January 17, 1991, and was primarily an air campaign. Conscious of the possibility of civilian casualties as their forces descended upon Iraq, coalition forces had a long list of no-fire targets to minimize civilian casualties, which included schools, hospitals, mosques, and historical sites. But the realities of war meant that these places were never 100% safe. US officials pitched it as a new modern war, where sophisticated targeting systems and precision-guided munitions would make collateral damage a thing of the past. Such a promise cared more about favorable media coverage than the reality of waging war in a populated country, and it set an impossibly high moral standard the coalition forces were doomed to miss. These high-flying promises were shattered almost immediately. On the first day of Desert Storm, an airstrike on the Diwania telephone exchange went awry, and the bombs instead hit a hotel and apartment complex nearby, killing 15 civilians. On January 20th, at least 12 people were killed, and 50 houses were damaged in the town of Najaf when bombs again went off target. Similar episodes happened across Iraq almost every day of the war. Missile attacks had no less potential to go wrong either. The US deployed its advanced Tomahawk missile at $2 million a shot, counting on their accuracy and high yield to strike targets in the first 2 weeks of Desert Storm. On February 1st, 6 of these missiles were launched at the Al-Rashid Air Base near Baghdad, where intelligence sources believed Saddam was keeping chemical weapons. Unfortunately, at least one of the missiles went off target and came down in the Karada neighborhood where 18 people, including 7 children, were wounded or killed. It ended up being the last Tomahawk missile attack of the war, as US leadership decided they were too expensive and too unreliable to be appropriate for further use in Iraq. Even as civilian casualties mounted, coalition forces continued to trumpet the benefits of their precision munitions. In reality, less than 10% of the munitions dropped on Iraq were these precision bombs, and most were conventional dumb bombs. By mid-February, though, the public was increasingly aware of the disconnect between the promises and realities of collateral damage. A grim example of this came on February 13th, courtesy of the British, when 4 RAF Tornadoes were tasked with destroying a highway bridge in Fallujah, but some of their laser-guided bombs went awry and careened into a bustling marketplace. The bombs flattened buildings and left piles of dead and injured. One survivor named Hamid Meshan described the scene. A bomb hit, and as soon as it exploded, the old buildings fell down. The people were buried, and I saw the men digging with their shovels to bring out the dead. I saw people without their throats. Some they did not find. Among those who were never found were Hamid's nephew and brother. They did manage to find enough of Hamid's son to identify him, but not more than that. Some 130 people died in the attack. The local hospital might have been able to save more, but with just 50 beds, no electricity, and barely any medical supplies, they could not deliver the care that was needed. British and US authorities denied that they had launched any attacks in the area for 2 full days, and when they finally did admit it, the British military downplayed the casualty numbers and refused to conduct a proper investigation into the affair. However, the Fallujah attack wasn't even the deadliest attack on civilians that day. That would be another attack launched by the US in Baghdad earlier that morning. Days earlier, US intelligence had identified a suspected military bunker, designated Shelter 25, in the Amiriya neighborhood of Baghdad. Intelligence claimed the bunker was camouflaged and fortified with barbed wire to protect a secret command center for Iraqi forces. In the early hours of February 13th, 2 US Air Force F-117 Nighthawks were dispatched to drop laser-guided munitions right on top of the bunker. No warnings were sent ahead for civilians to vacate the area before they unleashed their payloads. Both bombs scored direct hits, and the pilots returned to base with their mission successful. But the Amiriya bunker had not been a military command center. It was a civilian air raid shelter. The shelter had been open to the public since the war began. With running water, electricity, cooking facilities, and even a working TV and video player, it had become an unofficial community center for the locals. Children would gather to watch American movies in the evenings, escaping the realities of the American bombs battering their country. When the bomb struck, virtually everyone in the bunker was killed instantly. The entire top floor was incinerated, and only those on the bottom floor had even the slimmest chance of survival. One survivor who lost his parents and sisters in the blast only remembered being violently awoken by the force and heat of the blast. In his confusion after the explosion, he reached for his mother in the bed beside him, but in his words, he found only pieces of flesh. Rescuers spent hours trying to pull survivors from the smoldering ruins. The heat of the blast had melted the shelter's doors closed, and fire crews couldn't use water to put out the flames because the heat would instantly turn the water to steam that could kill the survivors. International media was on the scene by that afternoon, broadcasting harrowing images as the first remains were recovered from the smoldering bunker. The Iraqi government determined that 204 people had been killed, chiefly women and children, but other estimates have gone as high as 1,200. Just 8 people were pulled from the ruins alive. At first, the Bush administration defended the attack, insisting that it had been a military target. As proof of civilian casualties mounted, they blamed the Iraqi military and Saddam for putting civilians into valid military targets. Investigations found no evidence of the supposed command and control center inside the bunker. Ultimately, the civilian deaths were described as an unintended consequence of the war, and there were many, many more of them to come. As part of the war effort, coalition forces attacked the infrastructure of Saddam's regime, especially the electrical grid. To this end, the US employed a mix of specialized graphite bombs to temporarily disrupt electrical equipment and conventional explosives to destroy them. These attacks began immediately in Desert Storm. On January 18th, for example, US aircraft destroyed power stations, generators, and transformers at the Al Abbas Dam near Mosul, plunging the city into darkness. By the end of Desert Storm, 4 of Iraq's 5 hydroelectric dams had been knocked out of operation, and 95% of Iraq's power grid had been destroyed. In 1994, the country's electrical output was comparable to what it had been back in 1920. The US had quite literally bombed them back into a dark age. Naturally, Iraq's civilians bore the brunt of the cost for this destruction. Water purification and distribution in Iraq depended upon electrical systems, as did sanitation and sewage management. As those systems ground to a halt, water shortages became a serious threat. While only 54% of rural Iraqis had running water before the war, it was virtually 100% in the cities, with no ready alternatives for when the water stopped running. By March 1991, Baghdad's water systems were operating at 5% of their pre-war level, and sewage treatment stations were at a virtual standstill, with reports of raw sewage flooding into streets and homes. Water purification was further handicapped by US strikes on chemical plants across the country. According to a WHO report, quote, "The chemical plants which used to supply the main treatment elements, aluminium sulfates and chlorine, have been destroyed by bombing." The US rationale was that these chemicals could have been used for Iraq's elusive chemical weapons program. Food was similarly affected. Before the war, 70% of Iraq's food had been imported, and UN embargoes in the lead-up to Desert Storm had forced a hasty and not entirely successful pivot to domestic food production. Farmers were excused from the military draft, and rationing was imposed, but food insecurity would still be a constant menace during Desert Storm. As always, US bombing did nothing to help matters. In early February, 4 government food warehouses in Diwaniyah were bombed, depriving the city of vital food stores. Warehouses were also hit in other cities like Basra, while food production sites like flour mills were hit elsewhere. A particularly egregious blow to food supplies, at least according to the Iraqis, was the destruction of a large industrial site outside Baghdad on January 21st. The US claimed it was a chemical weapons plant, while the Iraqis said it was producing baby formula. The UN estimated some $500 million worth of damages to food production and stockpiles thanks to Desert Storm. Tasked with dealing with these many spiraling crises was Iraq's healthcare system, but it was faced with insurmountable challenges of its own. The loss of electricity and reliable water was immediately devastating for every corner of the healthcare industry. The combination of injuries from the war, food shortages, unclean water, collapse of medical supply chains, and the diseases that thrived in those conditions was simply too much to handle. Doctors Without Borders estimated that most of the country's hospitals could not operate at more than 5 to 10% of their usual capacity. Then, of course, there were the bombs. Multiple hospitals were hit, and emergency responders were liable to be killed by secondary strikes when responding to initial attacks. In Al-Zubair, an airstrike took out the city's only hospital, leaving its 150,000 people to care for themselves. All of this was made worse by Iraq's demographics. Around 20% of its population were children under 5, who were most vulnerable to the concoction of malnutrition, disease, and infection that gripped the country. The results were predictable. The Al-Qadisiyah Hospital in Baghdad reported an average of 20 child deaths per day from otherwise treatable infections alone. Antibiotics had to be rationed to only the most serious case. But hardest hit were the maternity wards. Maternal and infant mortality soared. Some hospitals reported a 100% death rate among their premature births, since they could not power the incubators needed to keep them alive. Many Iraqis tried to escape Iraq, but this journey was risky. The primary route used by Iraqi evacuees was the 915-kilometer-long Baghdad-Amman highway to Jordan. Tens of thousands of people fled along it, but they were hounded by unpredictable attacks from coalition planes, who marked them as enemy vehicles. Hundreds of evacuees reported being strafed by aircraft along the highway. In the first week of the war, at least 14 people were killed along the road in such a manner. It is not clear why these people were targeted, and what made them appear to be military targets. Buses were especially vulnerable, both being slow and easy to notice. For example, on February 13th, a bus carrying mostly Sudanese evacuees from Iraq was struck by a bomb, killing all 30 or so people on board. Attacks became so common that bus drivers started to drive only at night, and often without headlights, so they wouldn't be noticed by the planes. The same phenomenon occurred on the highway out of Kuwait City. perhaps the worst bus attack on that route claimed 27 passengers, when 2 bombs struck a bus carrying people away from the city on February 9th. Another common target along the highways were oil tankers. These weren't evacuees, but civilians supplying Iraq in a civilian capacity. Every evacuee's car and backup generator still needed fuel, and these tank trucks were one of the only sources. To the US and its allies, they were legitimate targets, with dozens of tankers and their drivers killed along the roads into Iraq. No highway became more infamous as a scene of death and destruction as Highway 80 running between Kuwait City and Basra in Iraq. When ground operations began in earnest on February 24th, Iraqi forces were quick to retreat from Kuwait, along the highway using a mix of military and stolen Kuwaiti vehicles. US bombers launched targeted attacks at key points along the route that blocked the road and effectively trapped the Iraqi vehicles in a kill zone. What followed has been described as a turkey shoot, where helpless Iraqi forces were strafed and bombed for 2 days straight. Most troops abandoned their vehicles and fled into the desert or turned themselves over to Allied troops. There was no serious resistance from the Iraqis for the entire attack. By February 27th, over 1,000 vehicles had been destroyed, and hundreds of Iraqi troops were dead. Vivid images of burned-out cars and the charred corpses of their occupants earned it the nickname of the Highway of Death. While civilian casualties were minimal, the brutal punishment of soldiers who were not able to fight back was controversial. It was a pointless waste of life, especially since a ceasefire was agreed the day after on February 28th, effectively ending the war. However, the same issues were raised again just 2 days later, when another battle broke out in spite of the ceasefire. Yet again, it concerned a convoy of Iraqi troops and disproportionate force used to deal with them. On March 2nd, a column of Iraqi vehicles crossed the Har River near the Rumaila oil fields. Nearby US forces were monitoring them when someone in the Iraqi column fired an RPG in their direction. The US response was swift and thorough. Armored vehicles, artillery, and helicopters descended on the column for almost 7 hours. Iraqi resistance was disorganized and most troops fled or surrendered. Many stripped off their uniforms and fled into the nearby marshes to hide. By the time fighting stopped at 3 p.m., around 300 tanks or armored vehicles and 400 other vehicles had been destroyed, along with an estimated 700 or more Iraqi deaths. The Americans suffered 1 man wounded and lost 2 vehicles to accidents and secondary explosions. There is no doubt that the Iraqis shot first, but the overwhelming response from the US has been criticized as excessive and cruel, taking hundreds of lives that never needed to be taken. For all of its controversy though, Desert Storm was ultimately considered a military success. In 6 weeks, they had ended Saddam's invasion of Kuwait and delivered a decisive military defeat to his regime. It came at an acceptably low cost to coalition forces, who lost just under 300 men compared to tens of thousands of Iraqis. Direct civilian deaths from Desert Storm have been estimated as between 2,000 to 3,500. Proportionally, this was lower than in previous conflicts. According to one study, 1 civilian was killed for every 4 tons of bombs dropped during the Normandy campaign of World War II. 1 died for every 15 tons in Vietnam, and 1 died for every 38 tons in Desert Storm. Clearly, US bombing strategies were causing less collateral over time, but the very real consequences for the thousands of victims was not eased by simple statistics. Nor is the cost easy to measure in death alone. The bridges, hospitals, water treatment systems, power stations, and more destroyed or damaged by Desert Storm would take years to rebuild. And many would argue Iraq had not recovered before a second, far longer US military intervention began in 2003. Despite controversy about the war today, especially in light of the 2003 Iraq War, around 80% of Americans polled after the Amiriya bombing still supported Desert Storm. Although a Human Rights Watch report determined that at times, quote, Allied forces fell short of their duty to utilize means and methods of attack to minimize the likelihood of civilian casualties, no one was punished for causing civilian casualties. In 1991, a war crime case by Iraqi civilians against President Bush and other leaders was thrown out of a Belgian court. The defense is that these civilian casualties were an unfortunate but justifiable cost to end Saddam's invasion in Kuwait. Saddam's invasion was certainly brutal and unjustified, but did the suffering inflicted on Iraq go too far? Estimates say around 1,000 civilians were killed by Iraqi forces in Kuwait, about half of the total killed directly by Desert Storm. In their mission to spare some people from suffering, did coalition forces simply inflict even more suffering elsewhere? That is a question that the Iraqi people, Desert Storm veterans, and historians have been wrestling with ever since. On April 7, 1994, members of the Hutu ethnic group in the eastern Central African country of Rwanda heard a broadcast coming from the popular and extremist radio and television station RTLM, Radio Télévision Les Mille Collines, radio television of the land of 1,000 hills, the name many Hutu called Rwanda. The broadcast called on them to begin cutting down the tall trees. All Hutu knew the nickname for those Rwandans in the Tutsi minority, who were generally taller than most Hutu. With that call, members of the Hutu paramilitary groups Interahamwe, those who work together, and the Impuzamugambi, those who have the same goal, as well as Hutu members of the Rwandan army and police, began one of the most sudden and rapid genocides in history, with machetes. From 1885 to 1961, Rwanda was a possession of two European countries, Germany from 1885 to 1919, and Belgium from 1919 to 1961. The same held true in neighboring Burundi, which was also populated by Hutu and Tutsi peoples. During this period, European ideas about ethnicity and racial superiority permeated much of Africa. To many Europeans, there was no doubt white Europeans were superior to black Africans. But people are people, no matter what their color, and it doesn't take much for one group of people to hate another, even if they look very similar to each other. There is a long, complicated history of tribal relations and tribal warfare in Rwanda and the area around it. To the north, Uganda has had issues between different ethnic groups, and to the south, in Burundi, ethnic tensions got so high in 1972 and 1993 that hundreds of thousands of people were killed. In Burundi and Rwanda, the two dominant ethnic groups are the Hutu and the Tutsi. Caught between them in Rwanda are the Twa, a pygmy tribe who likely are the area's indigenous people. The Tutsi and Hutu moved into the region hundreds of years ago, and by the 16th century had established a variety of different kingdoms in the area. From the 16th to the 19th century, there were times of ethnic violence between the two groups. Though the level and frequency of this ethnic violence decreased when Europeans took over, tensions often ran high, and violence did occur. There were many reasons for the tensions between Hutu and Tutsi. One of them was simple: power. Hand in hand with power is economics. And finally, there are the illogical reasons that people use to set themselves apart or claim superiority over another around the world. Appearance, education or the lack of it, or just plain differences that the two groups simply don't understand, care to understand, or willfully put down. When the Germans and later Belgians moved in, they largely controlled the ethnic violence in the area, mostly out of concern that large-scale violence would interfere with the economy of the area, which both nations profited from. Unfortunately, a byproduct of European control were European ideas about race and ethnicity. Let's be clear, we are not saying that the ethnic tension and the incredible violence of 1994 was caused by the legacy of European colonialism. It was not. There was plenty of ethnic hatred in the region before the arrival of the Germans and Belgians. But ideas that filtered into Rwandan society from the period of European control did not help the situation either. In the 1920s through the end of World War II, there was a popular scientific movement in Western Europe, North America, and Australia called eugenics. Simply put, eugenicists believed that there were superior and inferior people in the world, and that perhaps through science, but also through the law and the changing of cultural norms, mankind will be best served if those who were superior ran things while those who were inferior supported the system. In other words, did the heavy lifting. Eugenics gave Europeans and white Americans a scientific basis for their belief in white supremacy. Let's be honest, while the vast majority of Europeans and white Americans were not marching in the streets and calling for ethnic violence like the Nazis and the Klan and the ignoramuses of today, it's safe to say the majority of Europeans and white Americans held some notions of white superiority, whether they displayed it overtly or held the feelings close to the vest. Before World War II, white superiority was not a fringe movement. It was part of everyday life. And it was that way in the European colonies in Africa as well. By the 1920s and 30s, eugenics had begun to influence government policy in Rwanda and elsewhere. You may have seen newsreels from World War II-era Nazi Germany of scientists measuring the circumferences of skulls, eye color, height, and much more. Sadly, this was not unique to Nazi Germany. In the US, Britain, Canada, and Australia especially, similar studies took place, some leading to horrible results like forced sterilization and increased discrimination. In Rwanda, the Belgian colonial government institutionalized these beliefs. Of course, white Europeans were on top. Then came the Tutsis, then the Hutu, then the Tuareg. At the time, immediately prior to the 1994 genocide and today, the Tutsis were the minority group in the country, with the Tuareg at the very bottom. Just before 1994, it's estimated that the Tutsis made up about 15% of the nation's people, the Hutu about 83 to 84%, and the Tuareg 1 to 2%. There were just under 8 million people in Rwanda in 1993. Even before the popularity of eugenics, the Belgians viewed the Tutsi as a superior group. They were generally taller, lighter skinned, and more Caucasian in their facial structure than the Hutu. And in the eugenics-dominated 1920s, 30s, and 40s, this meant, well, you know, that the Tutsis were superior. And therefore, most of the jobs available to Africans in government, the police, and in the colonial army went to the Tutsi. What follows is a very simplified explanation. For their part, many Tutsi bought into the Belgian idea of their superiority. Honestly speaking, who wouldn't? Very few. For decades, in schools, books, and newspapers, it was the Tutsi who read and heard of their supposed superiority. The situation was sort of self-perpetuating. The Belgians believed the Tutsi to be superior to the Hutu, and not only gave the Tutsi more privileged and powerful positions, they also gave them land, some of which had belonged to Hutu groups. For Tutsi children, many of whom knew nothing except what the Belgian-run school system taught them, the fact that their people had the best jobs, had the most power, made the most money, well, guess what? It proved that they were superior. From the time the Belgians moved in, Rwandans were issued passes that indicated what ethnic group they belonged to, and this determined your access to education, a good job, and preferential treatment. The IDs were necessary because in some cases it was not possible to tell what group a person belonged to. That's how solid the science was. Needless to say, for every action, there is a counter-reaction. As time went by, resentment built among the Hutu. From 1945 to 1961, the United Nations took control of Rwanda, at least in name. Rwanda became the United Nations Mandate of Rwanda, but it was administered by the Belgian government. The idea was that in 15 years, the people of Rwanda would be educated and given control of their own country. However, by the late 1950s, many African people, from the Mediterranean in the north to the Cape of Good Hope in the south, had had enough of European colonialism. Many European countries spent the World War II and post-World War II years talking all about liberty, self-determination, and the need to control the human impulse towards prejudice. For the Holocaust had opened people's eyes to what could happen when prejudice went unchallenged. Except, to many people in Africa as well as Asia, it seemed that Europeans didn't include them in those ideals. For many European nations, especially in Western Europe, seemed to believe that those principles only applied to them, among themselves, and they continued to hold power in territories around the world. Throughout Africa, independence movements began. Rwanda was no different, but its small size and divided population helped the Belgians maintain control. And truth be told, the Tutsis were worried that once the Belgians left, the Hutu would rise up and take power, and perhaps vengeance. The Hutu had overthrown the last Tutsi king of Rwanda in 1959, King Kigri V, whose family had ruled the country since the 1700s and was propped up in the 20th century by the Germans and Belgians. When he was forced out after just a few months on the throne, a period of instability began. It was hoped the stability would come when Rwanda officially gained its independence in 1961 and elected a Hutu president, but that was not to be the case. In 1963, 2 years after independence, militant Hutu, both inside and outside the government, fomented a violent attack on the Tutsi, and approximately 130,000 Tutsi were killed, including most Tutsi politicians. This round of violence stemmed from rumors of the death of a Hutu leader. It wasn't true, but at this point, all the Hutu needed was an excuse. For their part, many Hutu had begun to believe that it was their group which was superior to the Tutsi. A new movement called Hutu Power had sprung up in the later 1950s, partly a reaction to Tutsi domination, and partly as a reaction to the growing popularity of pro-African literature, which was being published throughout the continent by anti-colonial groups. Much of this literature pointed out the age of African civilization compared to that of Europe, and glorified the ancient African kingdoms of the past, including the Hutu-dominated areas in Rwanda and Burundi. Additionally, the Hutu Power movement pointed out that the Hutu had arrived and established their culture in the area long before the Tutsi, who they considered invaders, arrived. No one asked the Twa, most of whom were content enough to be left alone in the remote mountains and forests of the country, where they had lived semi-nomadic lives for centuries. The Hutu Power movement grew throughout the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, though it must be said that many Hutu, especially in the capital Kigali, were more moderate, and like moderate Tutsis, hoped that an equitable and peaceful nation might emerge, and at times it looked as if it were possible. In 1988, thousands of Tutsi who had fled the country in the 60s and their grown children formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, and with support from Tutsi and neighboring nations and others, formed an army which began a civil war with the Hutu government of Juvenal Habyarimana, who had taken control of the country in a bloodless coup in 1973. Habyarimana installed a totalitarian regime in the country, but at first, many looked upon his as a possible peacemaker between the two groups, for he was reluctant to support some of his own party's programs to make sure Hutu were in positions of power throughout the country. The remaining Tutsi, located largely in the cities, especially Kigali, hoped that Habyarimana would be able to bring about some sort of arrangement that would bring peace to Rwanda and some assurances for the Tutsi. But as time went by, Habyarimana came more and more under the sway of militant Hutu in government and the army, and continued to ensure that Hutu remained dominant in the country, though not in the extreme way the Hutu power militants wanted. One of the other problems facing Habyarimana and Rwanda was extreme poverty. In 1989, a huge drop in coffee prices worldwide, the country's main export, drove more people into poverty in an already extremely poor country. Habyarimana's government, Tutsi interference, and the Europeans were blamed by Hutu militants, who grew in power because of the economic bad times. By 1990, the RPF was advancing into the country from the north, west, and south. In 1992, Habyarimana had entered into talks with the RPF and its leaders, and the next year, a new agreement was drawn up which was supposed to be the basis of a new constitution, which included power sharing among the two groups. It took 2 more years of fighting and negotiation before the Arusha Accords, named for the town where the negotiations took place, were implemented and which opened government positions to everyone, regardless of ethnicity. Nine months later, Habyarimana was killed, as was the president of Burundi and the Rwandan army's chief of staff, shot down aboard a French plane shortly after takeoff in Kigali. Fingers were pointed in every direction. The RPF and its leader Paul Kagame were blamed. Hutu power groups were blamed because they were incensed at Habyarimana's dealings with the RPF. Some militants on both sides hinted that they believed the Belgians or the Europeans were behind the killing, hoping to dominate Rwanda once again. For years, who killed Habyarimana was a mystery, but in both 2006 and 2012, French investigators came to the same conclusion. Paul Kagame, leader of the RPF and leader of the country after the genocide, was to blame, though he and his party vigorously denied involvement. That night, the RTLM radio station began calls for Hutu to rise up and cut down the tall trees, as well as crush the cockroaches. For almost 2 years, ever since Habyarimana entered into talks with the RPF, RTLM DJs had been ramping up the violent rhetoric against the Tutsis. What's more, unlike some of the other stations many Hutu listened to, they played music. And this music was not simply music to dance to, it was music to kill to. The lyrics encouraged violence against the Tutsi and by 1993 was calling for outright genocide. The Tutsi are ferocious beasts, more cunning than the rhino. The Tutsi cockroaches are bloodthirsty murderers. They dissect their victims, extracting vital organs, heart, liver, and stomach. The nickname of the station became Radio Genocide, openly. For months, Hutu power groups had been meeting for the express purpose of planning a full-scale elimination of the Tutsi from Rwanda. They were just waiting for an excuse. Habyarimana's death provided it. Throughout the country, Hutu militants had been collecting weapons at secret locations, ready to be dispersed to the crowds of Hutu who were getting more and more worked up by both rumors of the assassination and RTLM broadcasts. On April 7th, the killing began in Kigali. Tutsi leaders and those who had spoken in favor of power-sharing agreements were murdered in their offices, homes, and in hiding, as were their families. Most of the killing, even though extremist members of the Rwandan military were present, was done with machetes and the clubs and scythes used on the Interahamwe flag. The next day, April 8th, the killings began throughout the country. Tutsi communities were invaded by huge numbers of Interahamwe and Impuzamugambi militias, literally screaming and singing for blood. At the top, members of Habyarimana's family and inner circle called Akazu, or the Zero Network, for their desire to see Rwanda with a zero Tutsi population, coordinated some of the activity. Killing took place throughout the country. Chaos ruled. Some Hutu that were mistaken for Tutsi and did not have their papers on them were killed. Many moderate Hutu who had supported a power-sharing agreement were also killed. Not all the Hutu in the capital and other towns were eager to take part in the killing, but were forced to by the militias. During these horrible events, the Rwandan army either stood aside or took part, but were taking their cue from Interahamwe. Some incidents became symbols of the killing. On April 9th, at the Polish Mission Church at Gikondo, over 100 Tutsi sought sanctuary. The crowd burst through the door and cut them to pieces. The news of this massacre spread and eventually made its way overseas, where people in Europe and the US began to understand that something horrible was happening in Rwanda. On the 15th to 16th of April, the Nyarubuye Catholic Church was the scene of another massacre. This time, not only had people sought shelter inside, but many Tutsi had been herded onto church grounds. There, thousands were gunned down, clubbed to death, and cut to pieces. Throughout this and other incidents, many Tutsi women were sexually assaulted, sometimes multiple times, and always publicly. Most were killed afterward. Those who survived feigned death and managed to escape, but the number was few. In the western town of Kibuye, 12,000 Tutsi were hacked to death in a local stadium. Perhaps 50,000 more were killed in the hills surrounding the town. In Kibuye, thousands of bodies were dumped into giant Lake Kivu, which bordered Rwanda and Congo. In the north, thousands more were dumped into the Kagera River, which feeds famous Lake Victoria. The nations bordering Rwanda had to ban use and drinking of the water for fear of disease. Many of the victims in western Rwanda near Lake Kivu were Twa, who had been regarded as inferior by both Hutu and Tutsi for decades or longer. The sight of these thousands of bodies make a shocking backdrop to the horror in the Oscar-winning film Hotel Rwanda in 2005, which tells the story of the genocide and one man's attempt to rescue as many victims as possible. On the 28th and 29th, about 250,000 Tutsi were able to flee the country, mostly to neighboring Tanzania, a much more stable country. But by this time, most of the victims of the genocide were already dead. Early estimates put the number of dead at nearly 1 million. That has since been scaled back by most historians to somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000. By May, the RPF, which began to advance more quickly as the Rwanda army's discipline fell apart and the genocide began, took over the presidential palace in Kigali and slowly gained control of the country, which resulted in episodes of vengeance killing by Tutsi militia. By mid-July, the RPF announced that they would abide by the previous Arusha Accords and attempt to build a power-sharing government. One last thing. It was not until the genocide was over that any real attempt by international forces to end it occurred. French troops landed in July and established a safe zone in the southwest of the country. But at that point, no one was really sure which group needed protecting, the now defeated Hutu or Tutsi survivors. The UN, the US, and the leading European powers all came in for a great deal of criticism for their lackluster response to one of the most brutal episodes of the late 20th century. Who is the deadliest terror group in the world? IS? Hamas? Al-Qaeda? Many names might spring to mind, but for much of the 2010s, there was one correct answer: Boko Haram. Today, on A Day in History, we will look at how this small Nigerian terror group became one of the deadliest groups in the world through bombings, massacres, and kidnappings, all while waging a war against the government. Boko Haram emerged in the early 2000s from existing Islamist groups in Nigeria. Since the 1980s, the dominant Yanizala movement has shaped Islamist politics in the country. It had strong grassroots support thanks to its itinerant preachers and teachers who spread its message of rejecting un-Islamic ideas and beliefs. These groups took aim at so-called Western institutions and practices, many of them left over from British colonization, and wanted to root them out of Nigerian society. This included things like Western-style education, medical science, democracy, Christianity, and secularism. However, Yanizala refused to engage in more militant activism in pursuit of this goal, which caused a number of splinter groups to emerge in the late 90s and early 2000s. One of those groups was named Al-Sunnah wa Al-Jama'a wa Al-Hijra, meaning Group of the People of Sunnah for Dawah and Jihad in English. Sunnah is the Muslim term for the traditions and practices established by the Prophet Muhammad. Dawah is the sacred duty to convert others to Islam, while Jihad, which probably needs no introduction, meant in this context an active fight to expand Islam and destroy its enemies. Before long, the Nigerian media had another nickname for them, Boko Haram, a name which can be translated as Western civilization is forbidden. Boko Haram was fully established as an independent group by a former Yanizala member named Muhammad Yusuf in 2003. Yusuf took a harder line against Western ideas than other Muslim leaders and set himself up as an antagonist to the secular Nigerian state. This boiled over to violence in December 2003, when some of Yusuf's followers clashed with Nigerian security forces in the town of Kanama. This had a radicalizing effect on his followers and convinced many of them that the government was its enemy. There were several attacks by Boko Haram on police stations around the country in 2004, which led the Nigerian government to crack down and kill over 24 Boko Haram members, and forced its leaders to flee the country. The years between 2004 and 2008 was something of a dormant phase for Boko Haram. They committed a handful of hit-and-run attacks on Nigerian security services, but never enough to provoke a full crackdown or fully reveal themselves. During this time, many of its leaders, including Yusuf, traveled abroad to study with other radical groups, learning methods and ideas that would transform Boko Haram from a minor nuisance into a powerful threat. 2009 proved to be the fracture point, although sources disagree on what exactly caused the crisis to break out. One story goes that on June 11th, a convoy of Boko Haram members were riding motorbikes between the towns of Biu and Maiduguri when they were confronted by police. Apparently, the Boko Haram members weren't wearing helmets, and after the police tried to make them, a fight broke out, which left people on both sides wounded. Yusuf and his followers interpreted this as an attack and launched a wave of revenge violence on police and security services. Others claim that a Nigerian police operation, codenamed Operation Flush, designed to root out Boko Haram, prompted the group's vengeance. In the second half of July, Boko Haram militants launched a number of terror attacks on police stations and military targets across northeastern Nigeria. On July 26th, 70 Boko Haram militants raided a police station in the city of Bauchi, which caused a firefight that stretched on for hours and left more than 30 people dead. Fighting in the town of Maiduguri claimed more than 100 lives, as Nigerian forces cracked down on terrorist bases there. The Nigerian forces generally got the better of their enemy during the fighting. Their big victory came on July 30th, when they captured Yusuf and a number of the group's other leaders after fighting in Maiduguri. However, shortly after capturing them, they were executed by the police. Destroying the leadership temporarily scattered Boko Haram, but the extrajudicial killing of their leader galvanized the group. Authorities largely believed they had dealt with Boko Haram by killing Yusuf, but a few months later, the group re-emerged under the leadership of Abubakar Shekau, who promised the world that Boko Haram's campaign was only just beginning. Since 2009, the Nigerian authorities have been locked in a bitter war with Boko Haram. Although based in Borno State in northeastern Nigeria, Boko Haram's violence has spread to nearby regions and has also crossed the border into neighboring Niger, Cameroon, and Chad. The conflict has been long and bloody, but it is worth highlighting a few key episodes that show the danger Boko Haram poses. Rather than a conventional military conflict, the insurgent nature of Boko Haram means that the fighting has been mostly sporadic, initiated either by government raids or Boko Haram terror attacks with specific goals. In September 2011, the group flexed its strength with a bold attack on a government prison in Bauchi. The scale and coordination needed to pull off the attack were impressive, not to mention the fact that it succeeded. Boko Haram released over 700 prisoners, of which at least 100 were members of their group, and killed many guards. This ability to strike protected government buildings and overcome well-armed security forces set the tone for later attacks. Both Boko Haram and the Nigerian military have been accused of scorched earth tactics and massacres during their conflict. They have also both been criticized for collateral damage during military operations. Some of the worst examples of this occurred in the village of Baga during fighting there in April 2013. After Boko Haram members attacked a nearby military post, the military stormed and razed the village where the militants were hiding. Meanwhile, Boko Haram was accused of killing civilians to cover up their escape and implicate the military. Over 200 civilians were killed, and the village was all but destroyed, leaving thousands injured or homeless. Boko Haram's campaign of violence has therefore put countless Nigerians in danger, either through direct attacks or by turning their communities into battlefields. The Nigerian military's own aggressive response has not helped matters. As a result, on top of the thousands of deaths, an estimated 2.5 million people have been displaced by the ongoing conflict. Most of the victims of Boko Haram's violence have been civilians, not soldiers. Taking inspiration from other Islamist groups, Boko Haram has made bombing a key part of its terror campaign. Bombing emerged early as a strategy. A coordinated bomb attack in multiple locations across the country on Christmas Eve 2010 claimed almost 40 lives, and was perhaps the first major bomb attack committed by the group. These bombs were placed strategically at crowded areas, such as markets and churches, to maximize casualties on civilians. The pivotal attack came on August 26, 2011, when a Boko Haram militant drove a car packed with explosives into the perimeter of the UN building in Abuja, killing 23 people. Not only was this only the second example of a suicide bombing in modern Nigerian history, Boko Haram had committed the first at Abuja's police headquarters several weeks earlier. But the blatant attack on the UN drew international attention to Boko Haram for the first time. It was an embarrassment for the Nigerian government, who just 2 years earlier had declared the group destroyed. They were also undermined by accusations that Boko Haram had bribed security services to look the other way during the purchase and transport of the explosives. Since 2011, the group has vastly expanded its bombing campaign. Bus stations, hospitals, police stations, and schools are just some of the targets. What's more, the group has used women and even children to carry out these attacks. One 2017 study estimated that over 50% of the group's bombers were female. As for children, one UN study concluded that at least 30 attacks were committed using children in 2016, with the youngest being just 7 years old. Chillingly, attacks using children showed a higher average casualty rate than adult bombers. Boko Haram's violence is not entirely indiscriminate. Leaders who have spoken out against it find themselves and the people they represent targeted. In May 2014, one such critic, the 72-year-old emir of the city of Gwoza, Idris Timta, was murdered in an ambush by Boko Haram. Several days later, Boko Haram militants committed sweeping massacres around Gwoza, killing at least 300 civilians in scattered villages nearby. This was partially punishment and partial preparation for a large-scale attack in August 2014, where Boko Haram occupied the city and turned it into a base of operations. A similar show of collective punishment was seen at the Grand Mosque of Kano in November of that same year. Like in Gwazo, the local emir had been critical of Boko Haram and urged citizens to take up arms to fight them. The group responded by sending 2 bombers to detonate in the city's Grand Mosque during Friday prayers. When survivors tried to escape, Boko Haram gunned them down. 120 people were killed and 250 were injured. For Boko Haram, any critics of its mission are automatically enemies and traitors to Islam and deserve the same treatment that the group hands out to more conspicuous enemies of its cause, such as Christians. To Boko Haram, Christianity represents not just colonialism and westernization, but a direct attack on its Islamic view of society and the world. Sheko himself stated in 2010 that we want to fight Christians. We want to break your cross. We want to demolish all the churches. By 2017, the Anabaptist Church of the Brethren in Nigeria estimated that over 11,000 of its members had been killed, and 70% of its churches in Boko Haram-affected regions had been destroyed. Even medical workers, whose medicine is seen as another symbol of forbidden westernization, have been targeted, such as the 9 medical workers who were killed in the city of Kano for distributing polio vaccines in February 2013. But it is against education that Boko Haram has committed some of its fiercest crimes. Between 2009 and 2014, it destroyed an estimated 209 schools, at a cost of some $15 million to the government. It committed several massacres and abductions of students and teachers at these schools. For example, a massacre at an agricultural college in Gujba in September 2013 saw militants gun down 40 people at student hostels. Another attack in February 2014 at the federal government college in the town of Buniyadi saw another 59 students killed in horrific ways before the school was burned down. These attacks sent shockwaves through Nigeria. Many schools and universities closed out of fear that they would be next. This, of course, was exactly what Boko Haram wanted. Every day these schools were closed was another day Nigeria was free from the Western ideas these institutions were spreading to their students. However, when it comes to school attacks, it is the kidnappings that have grabbed the most headlines. On the night of April 14, 2014, a convoy of Boko Haram militants descended on the Christian village of Chibok. A detachment of militants broke off to attack the small Nigerian military squad stationed there. But the bulk of the attackers continued to their target, the government girls' secondary school. Dressed in uniforms of the Nigerian armed forces, the militants entered the boarding school in the middle of the night. According to survivors, the militants were originally there to steal an engine from construction equipment, but when they didn't find it, they chose to kidnap the students instead. 276 girls were then forced into trucks and taken away. A handful managed to escape by jumping from the trucks, but most were taken for years of captivity. Boko Haram's overall goals in the kidnapping are up for debate. It was, in part, a statement of power. Surviving girls also reported that conversion was a high priority, and that they were subjected to Islamic lessons and forced to wear the hijab by their captors. A few of the militants attempted to marry the girls, and some were reportedly forced to become concubines to their kidnappers. The kidnapping grabbed global headlines and led to sweeping condemnation from all corners of the world. The hashtag Bring Back Our Girls campaign turned Boko Haram into a familiar name outside of Nigeria. But freedom for the girls was slow coming. While most of the girls have since been rescued, Nigerian authorities estimate that 93 girls still remain in captivity. The Chibok kidnappings earned Boko Haram plenty of media coverage, and it is believed that they inspired the group to conduct more abductions. There were numerous kidnappings, often on a smaller scale in the following years. 40 were taken from the village of Malari in January 2015, 110 girls from Dapchi in February 2018, and more than 300 male students from a high school in the town of Kankara in 2020. These mass kidnappings continued until at least 2021, but the seeming fall of Boko Haram appears to have brought them to an end. Amidst Boko Haram's atrocities, the Nigerian government won a series of hard-fought victories that weakened the group throughout the 2010s. The 2015 West African offensive by a coalition of troops from Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger successfully dislodged Boko Haram from its headquarters in Gwoza and drove them into exile in the Sambisa forest. By late 2016, the Nigerian government declared that Boko Haram no longer controlled any territory and was now an insurgent group. The retreat of Boko Haram can be explained by a combination of its military enemies and its own internal struggles in 2015 and 2016. Following the rout from Gwoza in 2015, Abu Bakr Shekau pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. The Islamic State's surge of success in the Middle East at that time made it a tempting ally for Islamist radicals around the world, and a natural choice for Shekau's alliance. However, IS was less fond of Shekau than he was of them. In 2016, they attempted to seize power over Boko Haram by naming Abu Musab al-Barnawi as the official leader of IS and its allies in West Africa. This caused a schism that split Boko Haram in two. Shekau took a group of his loyalists and continued as Boko Haram, while al-Barnawi presided over the new Islamic State's West Africa provinces, ISWAP. The two groups pursued similar goals in the following years, but diverged in methods. ISWAP toned down violence against civilians compared to Shekau's group, and established itself as a more palatable alternative to the common people. By 2019, ISWAP had out-recruited Shekau and outnumbered Boko Haram by more than 2-to-1. It also employed more aggressive suicide bombing techniques against the government, better combat training for its troops, and allegedly drones supplied to them by allies from the Middle East that gave them an edge. By 2021, their differences had become irreconcilable, or perhaps ISWAP simply felt it was time to remove a loose end. The two groups were functionally in open warfare by the start of the year. This led ISWAP to mount a coordinated strike on Shekau's strongholds in the Sambisa forest in May. During the fighting, ISWAP overwhelmed Boko Haram and cornered Shekau, who detonated an explosive vest to avoid being captured. With Shekau dead and most of its fighters defeated, Boko Haram crumbled. A small faction of Shekau loyalists continued under a new leader, but the victory of ISWAP in May 2021 functionally eliminated Boko Haram, at least for a time. With Shekau's death in 2021, there were hopes that Boko Haram might be done for good. However, the killing of 37 people in Yobe State in November 2023 by alleged Boko Haram members following a failed extortion attempt says that the group still clings on. It might be on its last legs, or it might recover and become the menace it was in its heyday once again. Boko Haram might not be the longest-lasting or the most widely distributed terror group, but its colossal body count makes it one of the deadliest on the planet. Since it began, it has claimed an estimated 50,000 lives, most of them civilians, on top of countless others wounded and displaced. Even if it disappears, Boko Haram was not the first, nor will it be the last terror group that the people of West Africa have to contend with. And the legacy of Boko Haram's crimes will linger long after its perpetrators have disappeared.